All right. Welcome, everybody. Tonight, this is the first in our series of Baltimore City Green Party talks with people who have done important work in areas that we are working on. Tonight, we'll be talking to Dr. Lawrence Brown about his forthcoming book. First, I want to do a round of introductions. My name is Andy Ellis. I'm the secretary of the Baltimore City Green Party. We will be tonight. I will be one of your hosts. Jeremy Collins will be joining me. We'll be helping to facilitate conversation. Ash Esposito will be working the chat and the Facebook and the Q&A to make sure that any of the questions get answered. Karina Romero will be providing English to Spanish interpretation for any of those of you who are looking to listen in Spanish. And Andrew Annam will be doing our producer duties tonight, making sure that everything works right and that everybody gets to enjoy the show and that the stream is working, etc. Andrew, do you want to take some folks through a few of the ways that it's going to work tonight technically?
Sure. So hello, everyone. I'm Andrew. I'm a member of the Baltimore Green Party. And so if anybody is looking to hear this in Spanish, we are doing live interpretation. And that to do that, you go to the bottom of your screen. You will see a button that says interpretation. And then you select which channel you want. So you can choose English or Spanish. English will be the default, and then Spanish if that is what you prefer. And that will allow you to hear Karina as she's translating in real time so that you can follow along. So is there anybody that would like the Spanish interpretation? And if you do, you can just put that in the chat and we'll see it just so we know if we have to work Karina or if she gets the night off. But if you do want Spanish interpretation, just say so in the chat.
All right, and how do people ask questions?
So in order to ask questions, you should go to the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. So there is a chat function and you can feel free to have general discussion in there. But if you have a question that you would like Dr. Brown to answer, you should put that in the Q&A section. So if you put it in the chat, we may not see it because the chat might get a lot of people going back and forth. We don't want to lose any of your questions. So if you would like it to be answered, please put it in the Q&A. Click on that button.
Excellent. Thank you, Andrew. And with that, I want to introduce Dr. Lawrence Brown. Dr. Brown is a researcher and visiting associate professor with the University of Wisconsin Population Health Institute and a former associate professor at Morgan State University in the School of Community Health and Policy. He's been a leader of conversations about race, place, and space in Baltimore and has guided a lot of Baltimoreans to rethink the racial geography of our city. He has put an emphasis on the white L and the black butterfly that can be seen from the map. And has used a variety of different mapping strategies in order to make that very clear to Baltimoreans, the divided and segregated city that we live in. His forthcoming book, The Black Butterfly, The Harmful Politics of Race and Space in America, should be on shelves very soon, and we'll give you an opportunity to get some links of places where you can buy it later on. But tonight, he's going to be presenting parts of the book, and then there will be a guided discussion facilitated by myself and Jeremy, and then a series of Q&A. And with that, I want to turn it over to Dr. Lawrence Brown. Go ahead, Dr. Brown.
All right, if someone can enable the screen sharing for me, that would be great. It's great to be here with you all today. Thank you all for coming and joining this presentation with the Baltimore Green Party. Andy and the rest of the crew, Jeremy, thank you all for extending the invitation. I'm excited. My book does come out next Tuesday on the 26th. And I believe our good friends at Red Emma's, they have a very high stock of the book there. So that's one place where you can pick it up, but also at other independent bookstores like Charm City Books, Greedy Reads, Atomic Books, and the Ivy Bookshop. So I really want to talk a little bit today about how Baltimore apartheid really became established here in Baltimore City. And a big part of that is really sort of going back to 1910 and understanding uh, how Baltimore City became a hyper segregated city. And I really dive into this deeply in my book. So I want to talk about, let's see, I think someone, if you could enable screen share for me, that would be great. So the way that this happens in Baltimore is very interesting. There's this wonderful New York Times article in 1910 that finds Baltimore Mayor John Barry Mahul. He is the mayor that is in power when Baltimore City passes the first residential zoning law in American history. And so I want to show that to you really quickly. And so here are the three mayors I want to talk about today. I'm calling them the godfathers of Baltimore apartheid. And so we have our infamous mayors here: Mayor John Barry Mahul, Mayor James Preston, and then Mayor Howard Jackson. These are the three gentlemen that I want to focus on just for a little bit. So, you know, as they're in, while they're mayor, they pass these policies in Baltimore. Residential racial zoning, that's Mayor John Barry Mahul. Next up, racially restrictive covenants, we'll talk about that. The Chicago plan for segregation, we'll talk about that, and then the segregated public housing as well. So here's the Baltimore article in the, well, it's actually in the New York Times Magazine back in 1910. And so you can see Council Member Samuel West, he introduces the ordinance in the Baltimore City Council. So the Baltimore City Council plays a role in establishing Baltimore apartheid. And then right here, the man in the middle, Mayor John Barry Mahul, he's the one that signs it into law. So you can see the title of this article: Baltimore tries drastic plan of race segregation, strange situation which led the Oil City to adopt the most pronounced Jim Crow measure on record. And so this article, which you can pull up online, it goes through the whole story. This gentleman right here, George W. McMecken, some of you might know McMecken Street in West Baltimore. He moves into 1834 McCullough Street, and he desegregates that block, but the white community on that block is none too happy, and they end up passing this initial ordinance. We can see here, Monday, December 19th, and that's the year 1910. So for 110 years, over 110 years, December last year was the 110th anniversary, Baltimore has installed a drastic plan of race segregation because it has never been dismantled. This Edgar Allan Poe is the grand nephew of the famous poet. So that's not the poet himself, but that is his descendant. And so he's the city solicitor as this all happens. So at the same time, you had our good friends at the Baltimore Sun. They were publishing these articles that talked about Negro invasion, Negro invasion, Negro invasion, Negro invasion, this rhetoric, propaganda that the Baltimore Sun was putting out to stir up hatred against Black people who were buying homes in white communities. You had churches involved. Again, the Baltimore Sun, Negro invasion, the hospitals. So you got healthcare involved. So multiple systems, you got the signature of the nurses and Child's Hospital. They're engaged. Brantley Baptist Church, they're engaged. So the churches are giving sanction, religious sanction, giving the idea that God is on the side of pro-segregation to block the Negro invasion. Look at these churches. You got Franklin Street Methodist Episcopal, you got St. Pius Catholic, you got Memorial United Evangelical, you got Concordia Evangelical Lutheran. So all these different denominations These white churches were all trying to block the Negro invasion. They had the meeting in the church, just to let you know how devious this activity was. So, and I talk about that a lot in my book. So next is this is the scheme that Baltimore Mayor James Preston, who followed John Barry Mahul, he came up with a plan. He proposed a suburban colony to aid 90,000 Negroes. Negroes, what Black people were called at the time, sometimes colored, sometimes Negro. But this is where you see my field, public health, is involved, because the acting commissioner of health from the Baltimore City Health Department, they're implicated, because you see the acting commissioner, Dr. William T. Howard Jr., they kept pointing out that Black people were suffering from a higher rate of disease. So here is tuberculosis at the time. But over here, you can see pulmonary tuberculosis, pneumonia, syphilis, influenza, poliomyelitis, whooping cough. Black people were just dying at a higher rate compared to their white counterparts. And so public health becomes used as a justification for racial segregation. And that's another thing that Baltimore City, now we're talking about the Baltimore City Health Department, should and must reckon with. So you can see multiple systems, you got the mayor involved, you got city council involved, you got the health department involved. Multiple city systems are playing a role in bringing Baltimore apartheid online and then enforcing it. So later, this is now, we're talking about 1940. So this is during the mayoralty of Mayor Howard Jackson, when after 1937, when public housing first began to be built. It was funded, 3/4 of every dollar for public housing, or a large percentage, was coming from the federal government. And this was, a lot of it was during World War II, or in the lead up, the run up to World War II. So some of this was wartime housing. Others of it was really housing for lower income people. And you can see here on the left, public housing was racially segregated. You had Negro projects or public housing communities, and you had white projects. So that's one form of racial segregation. Look at this information right here. The darker the gray, the more Black people live in that census tract. Now, we all know what's up here: Mount Washington, Roland Park, Guilford, Homeland, Laurelville. Do y'all see any public housing up there in those wealthy white communities? No, you do not. Hamden, Medfield, all down, up and down the White L, except from over here, way out near the county line. And it was a white public housing project, which was O'Donnell Heights. Most of the public housing sites were placed in Black communities. Now I gotta come off the PowerPoint so I can make this point right here. There's that term that a lot of people use called concentrated poverty. It's a term that I hate. Dr. Brown hates that term. Well, Dr. Brown, why do you hate that term? Because that term does not tell you what I just showed you, which is how poverty became concentrated and who concentrated the poverty. Well, who did it, Dr. Brown? I just told you, and I'm gonna show you one more time. Who concentrated poverty? Public housing. They put low-income public housing developments in Black communities and on the waterfront. You can see there along the waterfront. Now, Dr. Brown, you know everybody likes living near the water. Yeah, today. But back then, you did not want to live near the water. That is, in the run-up to World War II, Baltimore is moving along at its industrial height of industrial activity. Those waters stank. You did not want to live in a harbor. You did not want to live near the water because it was polluted. If you had money, you tried to get away from the water. That's why you saw Roland Park, Guilford, all that at the northern part of the city. So you had public housing being placed in two kinds of communities: in Black communities and in environmentally polluted areas. These environmentally oppressed communities, that's where public housing was placed. So this is double racial segregation, folks. You got the segregation of the public housing units, and then you had the segregation in terms of where the public housing communities were located. Double racial segregation. So in fact, the Housing Authority of Baltimore City, now we're talking about the Housing Authority of Baltimore City, another system whereby which Baltimore apartheid was put into place, and this happened under the mayoralty of Mayor Howard Jackson, at least the beginning part of it. So another thing that happened under Mayor Jackson was the creation of this map. You can see here the date, May 1st, 1937. So that's in the early part of his term. His second, he was mayor back-to-back twice, but non-consecutively. So under his second go-round as mayor, this infamous map was created called the Residential Security Map. So a lot of people call it the redlining map, but you see 4 colors on this map, not just one. It's red, blue, yellow, and green. If you read Antero Patella's book, Not in My Neighborhood, he has a wonderful chapter in that book that talks about the pseudoscience of eugenics, fake science that purported the intelligence of different groups of people based on the color of their skin. And so, in that pseudoscience was then used as the basis for determining who could live in different communities. So in the green communities, you would have had white Anglo-Saxon folks. So and you're looking right in the middle, you're talking about Roland Park, Guilford, Homeland, right there. In blue, other white folks, but then also Jewish people, because early on, Jewish people could live in Roland Park, but then they began to be excluded. Roland Park Company excluded and blocked Jewish people from living there. So then the Jewish community had to live in the blue areas. Then you had yellow, and yellow communities are where many of America's immigrants from European countries would settle after they arrived in America. So you're talking about Polish, talking about Irish and Italian, Russian Jewish folks that were immigrating, migrating, trying to get away from the rise of fascism, violence in Europe, because Europe was going to hell in a handbasket, y'all. You had Benito Mussolini on the rise in Italy. You had Adolf Hitler, that fascist, on the rise in Germany. And the European immigrants was like, we tired of the violence. We got to go. We got to get up out of here. And so they came to countries like America. They tried to get away from the violence, pretty similar to how many Central Americans are trying to get away from violence in their communities today. But many of those folks migrating from Europe, they end up living in yellow communities at first, and then African Americans were relegated to these red, urban Native Americans and African Americans relegated to these red line communities. And so if you know anything about this map determines access to capital. If you lived in green and blue, oh, you could get all kinds of loans, good interest rates. If you lived in yellow communities, the banks were like, it's a little sketchy there. Those new immigrants, we don't really know what they're all about. So sometimes you get a loan, but it'd be like a high interest rate. But if you lived in that red community, oh my goodness, 9 times out of 10, the banks would not lend to those communities. So these end up being communities that were starved of capital for both home loans and small businesses. So one of the most pivotal maps in American history. And we see this map is a racial dot map, shows the spread of where people live in Baltimore today. 1 dot per person, and blue represents white, green represents black, red represents Asian, orange represents Latina. And you have this white L, black butterfly, in green, the Asian archipelago and the Latina lagoon. Right there, Baltimore, a hyper segregated city today because of what those mayors and following mayors did in Baltimore City. And we could see bank lending 10 years ago covering a 2-year period. Look at the bigger the dot, the bigger the loans. Look at where home mortgages were, where had they been clustered The bigger dots are in that white L. And then Northeast Baltimore, where it's a little bit more integrated. Here's small business lending. The bigger dots are in the L. A lot of them are in the harbor. You got going along Alisana on the waterfront. You got a cluster here. Looks like some industrial activity out there. And then down here is Southwest Baltimore, Pigtown, and then going further west. So, but in the black butterfly, which is where is colored green, the more African Americans live there, those dots are really small in the darker green areas. So this redlining is still going on, Now, this is a national sort of graphic from Zillow that shows here recently over the past, since the beginning of the millennium, how Baltimore, this is for the nation. So look at housing values for green, blue, yellow, and red. You see yellow and red are at the bottom. So that those houses that were in yellow and red, they have the lowest home values today. And then green and blue is doing pretty well, and green, oh my goodness, those houses are doing this phenomenally, over $500,000 if green community. So that color-coded scheme 80 years ago still has an impact today. Now here's what it looks like for Baltimore City. Well, I thought I had to find it and pull it up, but basically it's led us to this point here where you have white L communities with tremendous structural advantage and black butterfly communities with tremendous structural disadvantages. And now I want to say a few words about our friends, the Democrats. Those mayors I showed you, they were all Democrats. John Barry Mahul, James Preston, Howard Jackson. The last Republican mayor Baltimore City had was Theodore McKeldin. So when we talk about being in the moment where America is facing tremendous strife around racial equity and racial inequity, everybody's under scrutiny. Everybody's looking at, well, what can we do and how is racism playing out in our system, in our organization, in our institution? And I would submit, although we are glad that Trump is gone and Biden has won. Yes, we did. We are glad that President Biden is now in the White House. I voted for him. I vote Democrat myself a lot of times. But that doesn't excuse the fact that the Democratic Party has been the party of urban apartheid in America. We know the GOP. We know they're the party of the Neo-Confederacy. We already know that. But in urban areas, you had Baltimore, you had Democratic mayors like those I showed you in Baltimore City that helped build that wall. Yes, they did. They built the wall of Baltimore apartheid. And that, while we're in a moment of national reflection and reckoning, Baltimore City, the Democratic Party, has to also engage in a reckoning, has to also wrestle with this history. And so that's why I'm glad to have this invitation from the Green Party, because we have to hold our Democrats in Baltimore to account. We know that there are some progressive Democrats, but in America, unfortunately, you got a far-right party, the GOP, and then you got a center-right party, which is the Democrats. We don't have a left party in America. We don't. So if we're trying to get policies that are progressive, that help dismantle Baltimore apartheid, we're either going to need a party that's going to rise up and help make that a reality, or Democrats are going to have to face the music, look themselves in the mirror, and then hold themselves accountable for the damage they have done. So that's all I have right now, and I think we have some questions coming up. So I'll just end with this. We cannot make Black lives matter if we don't make Black neighborhoods matter. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Brown. I really appreciate that introduction. I can't wait to read the book. I ordered it and it's going to get here soon. It's going to be the first thing I do once it gets here. So I wanted to start with a question that develops on one of the things that you were just talking about. And I want to see if you can expand a little bit on the role that the one-party system in the city and the two-party system nationwide has played in forging the politics of apartheid in the past up to the present.
Sure. I mean, one party, well, there's the saying, old saying, you know, absolute power absolutely corrupt. So, I mean, if there's just no competition, if there's no other entity that can hold another entity accountable, when you concentrate and aggregate power, and you're the only way that governing can happen in the city, that's usually a dynamic that's not healthy for a democratic society. So we just got through fighting over democracy. We had people at the Capitol on January the 6th, the Jim Crow coup, trying to take over America. They were trying to take the Capitol building and arrest our Democratic congressmen. They were trying to usurp democracy. And if that's what we say that we want to cherish, then I think locally, we're going to have to be consistent with that. What are the ways that democracy is not fully realized? A one-party system is not democratic. When you don't have elected members to the Baltimore City School Board, that's not democratic. When you have Baltimore City, the Baltimore Police Department run partially by the state of Maryland, that's not democratic. When you have state control over local agencies, that's non-democratic. Because then Baltimoreans don't have the ultimate and final say over how these systems operate. And so I think that's the thing. If we cherish democracy, we're going to have to make it real in Baltimore. So the one-party system is a part of that, but it's also reflected in other areas like the Baltimore City School Board and the Baltimore Police Department as well.
So, hi, Dr. Brown.
Hey now.
I love this entire presentation, and I love the way the visuals and the graphics and everything is pretty explicit. People say America doesn't have a race problem, or people like to shy away from it and ask how. And you provide very concrete, explicit examples of this. So it's just the graphics, the actual words, they use words like get these Negroes out and stuff like that.
Right.
My question though is in this modern era, I'm wondering if you can speak more on neocolonialism and the relationship between Black faces and this white power dynamic. Because in Baltimore City, again, we're a majority Black city, and majority of our leadership is Black right now. I'm glad to say that we have our first Latinx council person with Odette Ramos, who's been very great with reaching out to her community. But again, most of the leadership in the city, we've had Black mayors for the past, Sheila Dixon, Pugh, Scott, Black city council presidents, Black city council members. So what does this apartheid city, what does this apartheid model look like in a city with mostly Black American leadership?
Absolutely, that's a great question. In part, I addressed that directly in my book. I think the first thing is, we start with what is neocolonialism. Colonization itself is when you take over somebody else's country and you take their stuff and then you sell it back to them at a surcharge, which proliferates poverty because they're not making money off of their own resources. So that's colonization, which we know from our history has happened, especially with European countries globally. The biggest example being the British Empire, going around the world, conquering militarily oppressed and indigenous peoples, taking their resources, but also the Portuguese, the Spanish, the French, many others. So that's colonization. Neo-colonialism is when you have independence movements that throw off the yoke of colonization, but behind the scenes, that old colonizer is still sitting in the shadows like, hey, you better pay me my money. And so you don't control your currency. You don't control the banks. You don't control the economic finances in your own country, for using the international examples. And so the colonizers would set up puppets in putatively independent countries that maintain the extractive arrangements. So the dictators like Idi Amin or others that were put in place and propped up by the French, by the Belgians, by the British, to maintain that extractive relationship. So in an American context, we're talking about internal domestic colonialism. And so when you talk about Black political leadership, the first dynamic is really the way Black neighborhoods are treated as spaces for extraction, subprime lending, predatory loans, check cashing facilities, pawn shops, liquor stores, all these things that proliferate poverty and generate wealth for colonizing external agents that are blockbusters that don't live in the community. They making bank off of Black communities. So that happens internally within America. Black communities and neighborhoods are colonized economically and don't control often the financial institutions or the ways of making money in a healthy way in those communities. So if you have that economic relationship and Black people become the majority, great migration, millions of Black people leave the South, and millions of white people leave inner cities. They flee to the suburbs, although in my book I call it white desegregation resistance and flight. Not just white flight, which is very innocuous, but we don't want to send our children to school, these Negroes. We are resisting desegregation and we will leave the city. So that's really what it was. So as the city becomes majority Black, if you want to maintain the same extractive relationships, then you put Black political leaders up front. You sponsor them through campaign financing. You put money into their pockets, and you set up quid pro quo arrangements, corruption. And we saw that 2 mayors ago, did we not? We saw corruption. We saw the University of Maryland medical system buying books that weren't even written and that they didn't even have, that were double sold, and they were sitting on the board with each other, giving each other all kind of fat contracts at the people's expense. They had privatized themselves in 1984 and were making bank off of public dollars. Yes, there was corruption. So that's a big part of how you have a majority Black political system, political elites, but the white economic wing that controls the wealth. And when you got that dynamic, you have that sort of extraction happening with neighborhoods, and then to maintain that extraction, campaign financing, quid pro quo arrangements, corruption to help prop up Black political leaders who are not really serious about racial equity.
I love that response and how direct it was. I guess my follow-up question to that is, so a lot, like you talk about segregation, and we just got, in the Maryland General Assembly, we have a Democrat, Speaker Adrian Jones, who has recently been recognized for having an explicitly Black agenda. Now, the Black agenda mentions creating a path to homeownership, amongst other items around healthcare and other issues. But with regards to like homeownership, she explicitly mentions redlining, access to credit, alongside reevaluating the home appraisal system, which you directly mentioned, and those systems that you presented to us directly attack. My question to you is, what considerations do you think are key to making something like this policy effective?
Oh, I'm about 90% sure you're probably talking about a proposal that the Maryland Democrats, under the leadership of Bill Ferguson, put together. He created a racial equity committee. So I think they came back with like a 47-point proposal for racial equity, to deal with racial equity in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. So again, as we were in this moment of trying to wrestle with America's structural and spatial sins, that committee was put together, and this is what they've come up with. So what the speaker, is it Adrian Jones? What they've come up with has some decent, nice little things in there, and we should celebrate it. We should push it, but it doesn't go the distance that it needs to. I mean, the dynamic I talked about, which I provided evidence for, really you don't end up with where we need to go. You're not going to end up with the real solution until you say we are going to dismantle Maryland, Baltimore apartheid. So not just nibbling around the edges, but going in all the way to the root in every system, all the systems I named, including the newspapers. I showed you the Baltimore Sun, right? So you got to go in every system, Housing Authority of Baltimore City. You got to go into the police department. You got to go into housing and community development. You have to go into the Baltimore City Health Department. Many of these systems played a role. And so if you don't come out with a 1,000-point plan, you're really not getting to the root, because there's so many different ways, multiple systems that played a damaging role. And then the question is not just racial equity. I think the way a lot of people talk about it is just because it's helping Black people. And that's not really what, the way I define racial equity in my book is when we actually as a society engage in actions that correct the damage that was done, that help repair the harm that was inflicted. So if you're not detailing all the harm, you're definitely not putting all the ways that repair needs to happen on the table. So reparations, now you start racial equity, social impact bond, which is another thing I talk about in my book, restructuring systems, dismantling systems. One solution I talk about in my book is I think we need to dismantle that old police department, shut it down, and then reconstitute into the Baltimore Peace Building Authority. So you got to look at all kinds of things and all kinds of ways in which Baltimore apartheid is manifest. I don't think this plan that they have does that. It may be a baby step in the right direction, but it doesn't take us all the way. So I think that's where we have to, I think, take that sort of view that there are some good things, but it needs to go a lot further.
Thank you.
And I think that leads to my next question, which is the Baltimore City Green Party recently added dismantling Baltimore apartheid and implementing racial equity to our 4-year accountability platform. Do you think there is an opportunity for alternative political formations and for alternative parties who take that as a central issue against in cities like Baltimore to emerge and to really foreground those issues in a way that hasn't existed before?
Yes, I talk about in my book that in some urban areas, the Democratic Party may be useful. So like if you're in Jackson, Mississippi, they were able to take, you had the Chokwe Lumumba and folks down there that were able to use the Democratic Party to begin to effectuate the type of actions that need to happen. But if you look at like Seattle, you have the Seattle People's Party, which has posed a serious threat to the Democratic Party. So, I think what I've tried to say is you look at the lay of the land, depending on where you are. If the Democrats are serious in your city, great. But if they're not, then you're going to need another alternative arrangement to help effectuate the dismantling of urban apartheid. And it could be there are some progressive Democrats that you can work with, and wherever you can, that's good. But if you just have that sort of obstinance, because you said that the Green Party platform was to dismantle urban apartheid, but that's not the Green Party's job. The Green Party didn't do it. That's the Democrats' job. They did it. They erected Baltimore apartheid. They have to dismantle it. Unless the Green Party begins to run the whole city, then it'll become your job. But right now, it is the Democrats' job. The Democrats of Baltimore City must look at their history, look at their mayors, their city council members, their agency department heads that actually put Baltimore apartheid in place, and then they sat on their behinds and let it run wild. So I think that's the thing. We need the Democratic Party to look in the mirror. We need Democratic Party to accept responsibility and then to make repair, make amends, correct the damage that it has caused. And we all want the dismantling of Baltimore apartheid, but I'm going to hold the Democratic Party accountable because they were the one that put it in place.
Excellent. I think Jeremy and I could probably ask questions all day, but it looks like there's good questions coming in from the audience. Ash, do you want to direct us to some of those?
Sure. Yeah, there's a question regarding education and how income tax determines school funding. Nico said that Nico thinks it's disgusting because it targets children, which are supposed to be the future of the neighborhoods.
I mean, certainly income tax plays a role, but taxes generally play a role. You can talk about tax increment financing, where if a city or jurisdiction looks wealthy because of TIFs, tax increment financing deals, like the $600 million one deal in Port Covington at the corner of the White L, that made Baltimore City look real wealthy because it shows up as a tax deal. And so the state is like, oh, y'all got all kind of tax financing that's working out in your city, so we don't need to give your jurisdiction as much funding through taxes. So it's not just income tax, it's the tax structure overall. And if you want to talk about funding, one of the main a couple things, but one of the main things that hurts Baltimore City Public Schools as a district, statewide, the way that funding works from the state is per pupil funding. So schools get money based on the number of students they have. I told you earlier, there's been tremendous white flight. And so when they fled, the school dollars went with them, thereby punishing the increasingly majority Black school district. So I talk about that in my book, and I say that's actually inequitable funding structure. You're better off having a per school funding formula, which then doesn't punish any school when there's a reduction of children. And there can be a reduction of children, like when you demolish public housing. Those children leave that school when the community is dispersed, and then the school is having trouble with resources for the remaining people that are there. Why should schools that are already struggling be punished when people are leaving the community for something that's not that school's fault, right? It's not the school's fault if HABC decide to tear down a public housing unit and then people end up leaving the community. That's not their fault. So why should they be losing funding as a result of that? Per school funding formula makes a lot more sense in my book, or literally my book. I say it makes sense to do. And I also talk about the need to have racial equity block grants for schools that are in red-lined, environmentally oppressed communities. So, I mean, in my book, I'm glad that I had a chance to really delve into like the intricacies of funding. What's coming from the state, what's coming from the city. If we want to talk about taxes, the other big tax scheme, aside from TIFs, tax increment financing, is pilots, payments in lieu of taxes. So you have your private universities, private institutions like Micah, Hopkins, Mercy. They sign pilots, payments in lieu of taxes, where they pay 5 cents on every dollar that they need to be assessed. So if we want funding for our schools from the city's contribution, we need people to pay your taxes. Hopkins, pay your taxes. Mercy, pay your taxes. Micah, we need your tax dollars because of what y'all are doing. See, y'all know about that private police force that Hopkins is putting together. Guess what? They are funding it with the tax dollars that they aren't paying to the general fund. So their lack of taxes to the general fund is subsidizing that private police force. That ain't right. That's raggedy and racist. And so what we're saying is, look, we need one of the best things that our private institutions can do is pay their taxes. That puts money in the general fund, which then now we can use to boost funding in our schools, boost funding for rec centers, boost funding for housing, community development, housing, permanent housing for folks experiencing homelessness. These are the types of things we can do. Baltimore is not a poor city. Don't let people tell you that lie. But Baltimore, we a poor city. No, Baltimore is a city where the rich don't pay their taxes. That's the problem. And so that's what we need to do if we're serious about racial equity.
Okay, and I have a question from Corinne. Corinne wanted to know, in regards to apartheid, like, have you looked at other cities and have you like studied like their history too?
Not as in-depth as Baltimore, but I do talk about in the book how Baltimore, when it passes that first residential racial zoning law in 1910, it becomes, well, Mayor Preston becomes mayor after Mayor Mahul. And you see in newspaper articles, some of which you may be able to see on my website, and I reference in the book, you see Baltimore Mayor John Barry Mahul, he's nationally going out telling people, hey, you all should try what we've done. This segregation thing is working out, is stabilizing property values. You too should try it. And so you see like in the St. Louis newspapers, how they're quoting Mayor Preston. And so in 1916, St. Louis passes a racial zoning law via referendum, the first city to do it that way. So St. Louis passes it, Richmond, Virginia passes racial zoning, Atlanta does it, Birmingham does it. You see in 1919, Mayor Preston goes to Chicago to learn, hey, what are y'all doing to maintain and enforce racial segregation? They say, oh, well, we got a whole thing where we got the building inspectors, the health department, and the police working together so that if somebody sells a home to a Negro, then we hit them with code enforcement, we send the police, we do we get the health department to condemn the home and kick them out that way. So it was a conspiracy, collusion. And so Preston comes back to Baltimore, yeah, like that's a good idea. We ought to do that here. So I do talk about in the book how Baltimore promotes urban apartheid and how it promotes it to cities like St. Louis. It learns from cities like Chicago. And guess which are the 8 Category 5 hyper-segregated cities today? The 8 Category 5, like a hurricane, the most intense form of racial segregation, there are 8 cities that are in that category. Baltimore, Chicago, St. Louis, Flint, Detroit, Birmingham, Milwaukee, and Cleveland. Those are the 8 Category 5. So the cities that adopted it and was helping Baltimore learn it, those are the cities that are Category 5 hyper-segregated cities today. So I think that's the thing that we have to wrestle with and reckon with, is how Baltimore was telling America, you too can be a pro-segregation city. You too can set up urban apartheid. And those cities are suffering today because they listened and followed along.
Thank you. And then we have a really good question from Tahira. Tahira asked, like, if you've been able to go over this history of Baltimore apartheid with city officials, and if you have, do you think it had an effect on how they see their role in upholding and potentially undoing these policies?
Well, before I left Baltimore, I was able to talk to one of my main groups that would invite me would be like the Baltimore Office of Civil Rights, which is now, I believe, the Baltimore Office of Equity and Civil Rights. I think so. Before it was the Baltimore's Office of Civil Rights and Wage Enforcement. So now it's the office, they renamed Baltimore Office of Equity and Civil Rights. And so talked to them on multiple occasions, gave them multiple presentations, and they're the ones that really need to know this history because they are in charge of enforcing civil rights, but and fostering racial equity. As a council member, Brandon Scott, invited me to talk to, I believe DPW, Department of Public Works. I've given them a couple of presentations. And, I say Councilmember Scott did because he was pushing the racial equity legislation a couple of years ago. So there has been some interest from folks in the city. Of course, we have a new city council. Brandon Scott is now the mayor, and their terms have just started last month. So I think there may be some interest in that, but not yet with this new configuration.
Thank you. And then we have we have a lot of questions. Terry asked if there were clear examples of how the coded map played in the development of public school system, resulting in the outstanding middle and elementary schools like Roland Park and Mount Washington, and the poorer facilities that are generally struggling.
I mean, it wasn't like a direct line per se. I mean, when you live in a red line community, all the institutions are going to be impacted, including schools. But it wasn't sort of like it was sort of that they were really thinking about schools. They were really thinking about capital lending. Now, if you talk about the ACs in school not working, the heat for the children not working in the wintertime, well, guess which budget that comes out of? It comes out of the capital budget for the city. So, in fact, you're actually raising. Most people think about redlining as something that happens in the private sector, which it does, the banks, right? But when we talk about that capital budget, now we're talking about the city of Baltimore, which shows us that public entities can redline too. And that's what I talk about in my book. I say that redlining is not just something that private entities do, but cities, in fact, commit redlining against their own Black neighborhoods. Like we saw with that resident security map. Well, I didn't show you, but the city actually partnered with the federal government to create that map. So, in fact, you have government as a public-private partnership when we talk about redlining. And I think that's the devastating thing. The capital that's needed in Black community should be coming from both banks and from public governments like our city, state, and federal governments.
Great. So our next question comes from, I'm sorry if I say this not right, but Kamaya, about nonprofits and how can Baltimore better unite Black-led nonprofit organizations to buffer some of the harms caused by Democrats or Republicans?
Better unite, better unite. So that means that there's division. But there's a reason for that division. Because if you're living in a red line community and you're trying to establish grassroots organizations, grassroots nonprofits, guess what? Everybody's fighting over crumbs. There's only a little bit that's being doled out to these communities. And therefore, that's why there's division, because there's a little bit of money that's coming into these red line communities. And then everybody's like, ooh, wait, there's some money. And boom, 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 and everybody jump on the pile to try to get scraps. And so when we think about segregation, that's what I want people to realize. And I talk about this in my book a lot, that the harm of racial segregation is not people living in different communities per se. Black people can live in their own community and still be successful and happy as they can be. If the problem is Black neighborhoods aren't resourced equitably so that Black people can be as happy as they can be in Black communities. And so I talk about Noliwe Rooks, her term segronomics. The real damage of racial segregation is segronomics. And segronomics is the economic weaponization of racial segregation. If you got some high school young people, if y'all college students, if y'all on the Zoom and you taking notes, write it down. Dr. Brown said, segronomics is the economic weaponization of racial segregation. That's the harm of racial segregation. And so that's the thing that has to really be remedied. You can have Black schools like HBCUs and do fine if they're financed equitably, which they're not. So I think that's the thing that we have to realize. That's what I want. That's one of the main points of the book, is that it's not about, America tried to desegregate bodies. Y'all come live over here and we come live over there. Y'all come to this school and we come over there. But what we really need to do is desegregate resources. That's the desegregation that has to happen. That's the desegregation that has never happened.
That is very powerful. Our next question comes to William Berry. Do you discuss E. Franklin Frazier in your book? He's certainly relevant to this conversation on neocolonialism.
I don't. I know I've heard of his name as a social scientist, but he wasn't one of the scholars that I referenced in my text.
Okay. That gives, I never heard of him either, so I definitely want to research more about whoever that is. Our next comes from Tiffany Holmes. Can you speak briefly to the difference between supporting Black neighborhoods and seeking to desegregate neighborhoods and the benefits of one or the other?
It can be both. You know, you can desegregate bodies. You can in the field today is called housing mobility. So you had like a court case like Thompson versus Hood back in the 90s. And they decided, I believe in the 2000s, they put a consent decree against the Housing Authority of Baltimore City saying, hey, you guys were wrong, essentially, even though it allows them to say we really didn't do it. But the consent decree is like basically the harm was done, whether y'all really agreed to it or not. But you had the surrounding counties, they essentially funneled their low-income African Americans into Baltimore City because they never built public housing like in Baltimore County and some of these other counties. So they said, hey, you got to go to Baltimore City. So they sent every low-income Black person they could down to Baltimore City, see concentrated poverty. They were helping to concentrate poverty in Baltimore City. So in Thompson versus Hood, they received, the consent decree said that the people in public housing in Baltimore City could receive a housing voucher to go out and live in those counties, housing mobility. Well, that's helpful for the people that get the voucher. If you get to go and live in an Anne Arundel County or a wealthy area in Baltimore County, which usually those vouchers don't go to end up in wealthy areas, but if you're able to go out and get to a more well-resourced community, that can be very helpful. The literature shows, the research shows that is helpful for those families. The problem is that's usually the only strategy for desegregation is to move Black people out to white neighborhoods. And I'm telling you, yes, that's good for those families, but that doesn't desegregate at the other end of the spectrum, which is Black neighborhoods themselves are still under-resourced. So without the desegregation of resources, without equitably funding Black schools, Black neighborhoods, Black institutions, which comes back to somebody else's question about those grassroots Black entities, then you still have many of the issues that affect and bedevil Black neighborhoods because they don't have, because of sacronomics, the neo-colonialism that you mentioned, Jeremy. So I think that's what we're saying is that it can be both. And people should have a choice. Black people should have a choice. Do I want to be able to live in the suburbs? You should be able to. In America, you should have the freedom to live next to rich, wealthy white people. That you should have that freedom. But you should also have the freedom to stay where you live and have a well-resourced, thriving community. Black people don't have that choice. And that's why there are all these narratives about, we got to get out to make it. Going out to the suburbs is considered making it in many Black communities. That narrative shouldn't have to be getting out of the hood. Like that whole narrative, instead of, for those who choose, yes, but also let's revitalize, let's do it without displacing the people that already live there. Development without displacement. So both of those should be options. I don't think it has to be an either or. Black people should have the choice. Do I want to go live out in Towson? Yes, I have that choice. Or do I want to stay here in Sandtown because we moving on up, baby? I should have that option. And I think that's what we only got. There's only housing mobility that's on the table, and housing mobility is only good. It's only being implemented for a few people, relatively speaking.
I love that you mentioned that because that actually takes us to the next question coming from Perry. Can you speak on some approaches on investing in Black communities to provide needed resources without ultimately leading to gentrification and wealthier whites moving in? I know a couple of years ago, this was a big thing with like bike lanes and people, especially certain activists on Twitter, equating bike lanes to gentrification. So like, how do we navigate that?
Well, I think we start by interrogating the word investing. Investing is a capitalist term. Somebody's looking for ROI, a return on their money. We're going to invest in Black neighborhoods. Well, y'all are looking for something on the back end. That is not what public spending is about. Public spending is not about ROI. Nobody says, what's the ROI on building this road and building this fire station? What return on the investment? No, it's not. It's a public good. It's something, it's infrastructure that's going to help a community be healthy, to survive, to be sustainable. So I don't like that term, investing. I think it puts us in their frame, in the capitalist frame. The word or the phrase that I use in my book is allocation. How do we allocate resources to Black community? Because then it's not about an ROI. It's about how do we make sure Black neighborhoods have this equitable, sustainable public goods. What we do in Baltimore is we withdraw public goods all the time. Public housing, demolish it. Let's tear it down and displace people. Let's public rec centers, close them up. These resources that are public, libraries, don't got enough of them. Public libraries, right? Especially in Black neighborhoods. So, and not really nice libraries like I see y'all got in Waverly and Roland Park and some of these other areas. Y'all got the really nice libraries. I go over there to Walbrook, there's a little rinky-dink library. That ain't right. That's what I'm talking about. Public redlining. So what I'm saying is allocation. How do we allocate? So and to allocate, you got to have the money. So Hopkins, pay your taxes. Micah, I know y'all on the call. Pay your taxes. That's what we're talking about. Pay your tax so we can allocate the resources that we need in Black neighborhoods so that they can thrive and survive.
That was excellent. That was excellent. And again, gentrification is very popular, and I guess it has to be, considering once you talk about investment and not allocation, you get this fear of moving people out to bring people in. So the next question coming from Catherine is—
well, let me spend a little bit more time on that, because there are policies that, see, a lot of people think about gentrification as the private market at work. Like the private market just la 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 la.
Hello, yes.
And capital's just running roughshod and is forcing Black people out. Well, that's partially true, but the real truth is gentrification is publicly subsidized from beginning to end. On the front end, you got Black communities that are deemed blighted, and so then those homes are demolished. EBDI, Park Heights Renaissance, the homes that were up there, Madison North Park, which some people derisively call Murder Mall. So you have public HUD, HABC, they finance the uprooting of those people, the demolition of those buildings, and then on the back end, well, in the middle, all of a sudden, developers come up and say, hey, we're gonna redevelop this area. And then they get a subsidy, TIFs, pilots. So that's in the middle. And then on the back end, once they build it, the people that don't live in the neighborhood, they get a public subsidy. Live near your work. Arts and entertainment districts, tax breaks. So from beginning to end, gentrification is publicly subsidized and financed. And I think that's the thing, you had with President Trump, what I call Trump zones. They call them opportunity zones. They're Trump zones. Trump zones, what they did was, we're gonna give tax breaks to people who invest their money in these neighborhoods. Well, they're investing because they're trying to get a return on their money, which is why you have Trump zones in downtown and Trump zone in Port Covington. What do they need with opportunity zone? Well, it was designed so that developers could gain wealth, not so that Black people could actually heal and grow their community, develop their community without being displaced. So all these urban schemes that the federal government, state government come up with, enterprise zones, empowerment zones, I talk about all of them in my book, promise zones, opportunity zone, Trump zone, all these zones ain't nothing but a scheme so that developers can come and get their money and leave Black neighborhoods high and dry. So they getting public dollars while Black folks are stuck in poverty. So that's what I'm saying. Gentrification has the public hand all up in it. It's not just private market, operating willy-nilly. No, Johns Hopkins, they give out up to $37 if you live close to their campus. If you're a Hopkins employee living out in Howard County, you can get a subsidy. So one of the things I talk about in my book is if they get a live near your work voucher, why don't we have a stay where you are voucher? If you don't live in the community, you can get $37,000 from Hopkins. And on the west side, Maryland, they got a live near your work program too, University of Maryland. Then the people that live there, give them an $80,000 voucher to stay right where they at. So as the communities develop, they can fix up their home, get their facade together, have the resources they need so that they can stick around as the wealth in that community goes up. Stay where you are voucher. So that's what I'm saying. Those are the ways we have to be thinking. And that's why we got to interrogate that language, not investing. Not investing.
I love that. Sounds like the city council needs to hear these words. Everyone, all 15 people need to be listening to this, and the president and the mayor. But on to the next question, which is kind of in the same sphere of housing and development, what that looks like. Public housing in the city is being revitalized and redeveloped. Does this present an opportunity or a possible disadvantage for Black residents?
If you go back to what I said earlier, public housing was intentionally located in redline Black communities, thereby concentrating poverty. So if you're talking about redeveloping public housing, then I think we need to be thinking about a couple of things. Number one, after a while, public housing officials figured out that building those big tall towers, like in St. Louis, Igloo Pruitt, or I believe it's the Roberta Taylor homes or trailer homes in Chicago, that those big towers where you just pack in lower income people, that's bad social policy, because you're stacking people on top of each other with few resources. All kinds of trouble is going to be the end result of that. So what they did is they started building smaller scatter sites, like flatter and then on a wider footprint. The problem, which is good, but then they only built scatter sites in Black communities. So thereby continuing the concentration of poverty. So when I think about public housing and redeveloping, revitalizing, I think about we need put some of that public housing in white communities. They ain't had it. I showed you the map. Roland Park, y'all need some public housing. Guilford, Homeland, Mount Washington, Laurelville, you need some public housing. And I think we got to think about that's racial equity is also spatial equity. If you haven't had to help with taking care of folks that are lower income in your community because of zoning laws and other exclusionary tactics that you've been deploying, racial equity means you got to undo that damage that you've done and welcome those folks with open arms in the white L. So I think a big part of public housing for me is, that part, the white L doing their part, stop concentrating all the negative stuff in Black communities, methadone clinics and liquor stores and all the stuff that environmental toxic pollution sites. You don't see no pollution out there in Roland Park. Why they put them in, but you see it down there in the harbor because that's industry. But I'm saying other than that, you don't see pollution sites in Black and white communities. So if there are disamenities, if there are things that are disproportionately clustered and concentrated in Black communities, the white L needs to do their part. They need to welcome public housing with open arms in their community. And I think the other thing is the privatization of public housing is decimating the housing that's available to people. So initially called Section 8, now it's called the Housing Choice Voucher Program. Like I said, a lot of public housing has been torn down since the 90s. Hope 6 under Clinton, that policy regime, which tore down 250,000 public housing units nationwide. And then people are given vouchers, and oftentimes when they're giving vouchers in other red line Black communities. So even if you look at where the voucher households are located, even the people with vouchers aren't in Roland Park, Mount Washington, Guilford, Homeland, they're not there. So even with public housing strategy of privatizing and demolishing those big units and giving people vouchers to move into the housing market, they're replicating racial segregation. So all of that, and I should say the Housing Authority of Baltimore City is probably the agency most responsible for Baltimore apartheid because of that history and where they located public housing, how they were racially segregated, how they maintain it through the voucher program, how they maintain it through the scatter site, where the scatter sites were built. So there, if you had to pick one agency, and really they were actually part of the Baltimore Urban Renewal and Housing Agency at one point, BURHA. So BURHA is probably number one, but it was a part of, HABC was a part of BURHA. So they right there, number one, in terms of being the agency most responsible for the current hypersegregation that we see in this city. So HABC has an inordinate responsibility to help dismantle Baltimore apartheid, which is why I say a lot of public housing needs to be in the white L. Stop concentrating poverty in low income Black communities. White L needs to do their part. Suburban areas like Towson and northern Baltimore County, they need to do their part because you don't see no vouchers up there either. America has to be serious about desegregation when it comes to public housing. And there are a lot more things we could get into with that. You got, choice neighborhoods. Sometimes when they tear these public housing developments down and they build a new one, traditionally you had residents that couldn't go into the new one when it was built until choice neighborhoods, and that was supposed to be have that guarantee, the 1-for-1 housing replacement. Will that be done when they rebuild Somerset? Will that be done when they rebuild Perkins Homes? Will people that live in those communities actually be able to come back? Because a lot of times what they do is have they use criminal convictions, they use a former non-payment of rent to exclude people, and then, oops, sorry, you can't come back into the neighborhood that now looks really good. So I think all these issues have to be thought about with public housing, because there's so many ways that public housing has been at the heart of enforcing and maintaining apartheid in Baltimore.
Thank you. We have a question from Karina. Karina wants to know if there's an explicit role that Baltimore white supremacists or white supremacist institutions, like if there's something that they need to do to address redlining.
Yeah, reparations and pay your taxes. This
Yeah.
is a two-step program. Pay your taxes and then pay compensation for the harms that you've inflicted. Hopkins ought to have a robust reparations program for all the mess that they done to Black communities. Yeah. And they should pay their taxes. So those are the two things that we need to seriously look at. By the way, one of the things I propose in my book is a $3 billion racial equity social impact bond. And somebody asked about nonprofits earlier. We should also be thinking about philanthropies in the city. We got Casey Foundation, Weinberg. Both of those have, according to a Baltimore Business Journal article a couple years ago, or it might have been one of those other periodicals, they both had like over $2 billion in wealth. The top 25 largest philanthropies in Baltimore had over $7 billion in assets and wealth. And so my thing is, my $3 billion racial equity social impact bond proposal, which would help get rid of that old raggedy toxic lead exposure that's messing with the brains of our babies and infants and toddlers. We need to protect Black minds with everything we got. If we could use half of that money to get lead out of water, out of soil, out of the air, out of the paint in people's homes. The other half we can use for $500 million for housing for people experiencing homelessness. We can use $200 million to do programs and things to put in place to get rid of transit apartheid, banking apartheid, resource apartheid, food apartheid, energy apartheid. Spend that money to help put some things in place to deal with that. Safe Streets got 10 sites for violence prevention. They need 40 sites. And unfortunately, we just lost Dante Barksdale, the director of that program, to murder in the city. So, that program needs to be greatly supported and expanded. $100 million for that. Substance abuse, because we know people ODing left and right. fentanyl's killing people. The program for 100 million, let's put 100 million behind greatly expanding the resources for that. So it won't fix everything, but that $3 billion racial equity social impact bond is a kickstart to move Baltimore in the right trajectory. Those 25 top philanthropies have $7 billion in wealth. So my proposal is, hey, everybody give half of your resources and boom, $3 billion, we got it real quick. And so philanthropies and folks that resources, institutions that got those resources, that's what they can do. Put your capital towards the healing and restoration of the Black butterfly. I also have another proposal, Baltimore neighborhood reparations, where we allocate 10% of the city budget for the next 50 plus years towards the top 20 red line Black communities, allocated to democratically elected neighborhood resource or neighborhood reparations councils, and 15 members representing a variety of segments of the community. They come together with the neighborhood to decide how they're going to spend those resources every year. So I think I was intentional about putting real solutions in the book. I told you about schools, racial equity block grants for schools, Black schools, majority Black schools that are in red line Black communities. I'm talking about Baltimore neighborhood reparations, $3 billion racial equity social impact bond. These are things that we can do. I've tried to be specific. I didn't want people to have no wiggle room. Well, Dr. Brown, what about? Nope, that's on page 345. Look it up and read it, and then we come back and discuss it. So I put it in there so that folks can have, it's a detailed plan. I kind of joke around as I talk, but I'm serious in this book. I'm serious. And I like this book. I've been reading it myself. It's a nice book. And I'll be reading it and I'm like, man, I said that. Yeah, I did say that. And it's good. I'm a tremendous scholar. I have to pat myself on the back sometimes. But yeah, I think that's the thing that we have to do. I tried to make it clear, explicit, and plain what it is that everybody could do. So philanthropies, nonprofits, city, agencies, I got stuff for all these different entities, institutions, so that they don't walk away saying, well, what could I do? You won't walk away wondering that when you finish reading the book.
Awesome. So Jocelyn's an awesome teacher at Baltimore City Public Schools. And she asked, all these structures that have white supremacy built into them makes me think that Baltimore is doing, or what Baltimore is doing with the youth during the pandemic. Do you think the current rush to open Baltimore City Public Schools is reflective of the systems that still exist? Black and brown students who are most in need are being pushed to go back into classrooms that have been underfunded for I don't know how long.
Right. Do I think that the systems are part of the reason what this push to get these children back in schools?
Do you think that white supremacy is built into that system specifically that's making them make these decisions?
Yeah, I mean, it's white supremacy and the way that it manifests itself, like not having an elected school board. A scholar named Domingo Morel, in his book Takeover, he talks about when you have cities that have, when they become majority Latino, Latina, or Black, how state governments swoop in and take over like school systems precisely at the point when those communities are gaining political power. So that's white supremacy. And that's what happened with Baltimore City Schools in the 90s. It was deeply underfunded. Advocates came and they sued the state. And the solution was, we'll give you money, but we're going to take over your schools. And since then, Baltimore hasn't had a democratically elected board of commissioners, the school board. So how would that decision look if you had more parents on that board, if you had people who grew up in the system on that board, if it was dominated by people who were elected from the community, as opposed to a lot of them being appointed by the governor and some being appointed by the mayor. So that takeover, as Domingo Morel talks about it, is a manifestation of white supremacy. And so Baltimore City Public Schools, these decisions are being structured as a result of those type of decisions which were made when the funding was given as a part of that deal. So, I mean, that's one thing that I talk about in the book. And yes, I believe that contributes to the push. I said at the beginning of the pandemic, or at least back in the summer before the school year began, I said, look, why doesn't the school system, especially while the weather is warmer, set up activities outside where teachers can still meet with students, wear your mask, but you're not in that building. You're reducing the risk for COVID if everyone stays masked. But you could do some things creatively. You know, they could have set up tents. They could have found pavilions. They could have identified different locations where you could still have some face-to-face interaction, because I think that's the concern a lot of people have. You have youth and families getting disconnected when it's just this virtual thing all the time. And so I thought that was a lost opportunity to not, because you wouldn't do that with all the schools. You would do that for the neighborhoods that are red line and subprime. Those schools, those are the children that you need to touch once or twice a week in person. You doing all right. You getting the food you need. But we're out while it's warmer. We're not in that school where the air without ventilation is ratcheting up that risk for COVID and the spread of the novel coronavirus. So I think there was a lack of creativity in thinking about, obviously when it got colder, that was going to be more difficult. But, you know, I've been in places where there are, you know, heaters and things that people use outside. I don't know. I just thought, like, we have, you know, all kinds of genius in this city. If people put their heads together, there could have been some in-person interaction outside in a space where you don't have the closed ventilation, which raises the risk for COVID. And you sort of get the best of both worlds. And so I think that that's also, well, to the question, is that white supremacy? Well, if you don't think Black people are intelligent enough to come up with these kind of solutions, then yeah, that's white supremacy too. So I think there are different ways in which white supremacy would manifest itself that would lead to the decision. And I think the other thing is this: a lot of times people, as we start talking more and more about equity, they start saying what's equitable for people. Well, it's equity. Black children are falling behind. They were already behind. You weren't fixing it then. So how is bringing them back to school going to get them? Are you saying you're going to close the gap? You weren't closing the gap before. So yeah. What are you going to do now that's going to magically do this? So I think the thing is, even though there is a disproportionate impact of COVID in Black communities, in a way, that's Black parents are actually more afraid that their children will get it. Or they're teaching in the school and they're afraid they're going to get it. And so I think that there's also like this imposition of, we know what's best. And the people are saying, no, we don't. The trust issues. A lot of times people talk about equity, and equity is important, but it's also trust. And it's a matter, trust is, do we trust that you're going to make sure that we don't get COVID, that the teachers don't get COVID, and they don't spread it to my child who's already dealing with health challenges? If that trust isn't there, like, again, you don't have a democratically elected school board. And if I don't know those people. So how am I supposed to trust that this decision is in my best interest? And I ain't elected, not one of them are elected. So it's not just equity. As important as equity is, trust is also an issue. And we know that Black people in America don't trust a lot of our systems because of white supremacy. So that's another manifestation, another angle. So I think white supremacy is implicated from multiple vectors and directions with this scenario.
Yeah, and kind of like what you said about like certain neighborhoods being like on the water, we know that some of those neighborhoods have been more impacted by pollution, and so the kids are more likely to have asthma. Mm-hmm. So to send them back to schools just doesn't make any sense, because they may have like pre-existing conditions that other neighborhoods don't. So yeah, we have a lot of questions. So I think it's probably a good idea to like take all the extra questions to Twitter, because like I don't even think I think it would take us like another hour to get through all these, but they're really, really good. And so that's what we'll do. So if you guys want to follow our Twitter account at Baltimore Greens, we'll give all these questions to you, and then we'll go back and forth and give the answers there. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you all for the invitation. Really appreciate it.
Yep. Thank you, Dr. Brown. I really appreciate it. It gives us a really good roadmap of policies and issues to work on and organize around over the next couple of years. And, we believe that right now the Democrats are the people who are in power, and we need to hold them accountable, and we need to show the people of the city what is possible. And I think that this talk and your book are a great blueprint for that. And I'm very excited to have had the opportunity to go over this with you tonight. Our next, we're going to do a series of these all throughout the year, talking to people who have different perspectives on very critical issues to the city and that we think relate to the platform. So keep a lookout on our social media for the next one. We know that Lauren's Grand Prix of Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle is really going to be delving into the concept of community control and reparative justice for our next one. So we'll definitely make sure we get that out. Before we go, let me ask you one more question, since this is a book talk. Where can people find out more about your book, your scholarship, and get more involved?
Sure. Well, a couple of those questions, my book, my scholarship, if you go to theblackbutterflyproject.com, you'll find out about, I think, the work that I'm doing, certainly some of the scholarship. I have a digital archive section on there where you can look at some of the primary source documents that I use in the work to help undergird the writing of the book. I have a teacher resource page if you're teaching K through 12 or even higher education, videos that you can use maybe in your classroom or even to inform your own teaching, or if you're doing homeschooling, or if you're working with the organization. Those resources I think are very helpful for a lot of people. And like I say, some of those primary source documents in the digital archives complement the book very nicely, or supplement it, I should say. And then what was that other question? I was thinking bookstores, but I want to make sure I'm answering that correctly.
Well, yeah, bookstores. Where would you like people to buy your book?
Oh yeah, well, stick with the independent bookstores as much as you can, folks. Baltimore, I know right now you can pre-order from Atomic Books, the Ivy Bookshop, Greedy Reads, Red Emma's. I'm going to take some book copies over to Urban Reads Bookstore and Everyone's Place as soon as I can get my hands on a good number from the publisher. So that may be later this month or early next month before those copies end up there. But yeah, independent Black-owned bookstores are definitely where I want people to go in terms of supporting the local economy as much as possible. Although there is a Black-owned bookstore called Turning Page Bookshop, owned by a Black woman in South Carolina. So if that's your preference, at least right now for pre-ordering, that's the only Black-owned bookstore that's carrying it and pre-ordering, I should say. So it comes out on the 26th. You can pre-order before then online, but hopefully, I think Red Emma's ordered maybe 70 copies. So they should be pretty well stocked, and hopefully other independents are as well.
Excellent. And how do people follow you on social media?
Sure. You can find me on Twitter at BMoreDoc, BMoreDoc. Find me there. I'm usually chatting and chirping away, talking about all kinds of stuff as it suits me.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We really appreciate your time tonight and the opportunity to have this discussion with you. Jeremy, anything you want to say as we close out?
Just everyone have a good night and stay safe in this Corona world. Mask up, keep it 6 feet, and use hand sanitizer, and we'll make it through on the other end.
Yeah, and the public health side of me says the vaccinations are beginning. I think right now the city's just entered phase 1B for like people who live in assisted living facilities, 75 years and older. So there are different websites you can go to where they have vaccine request forms for like Mercy, Hopkins, University of Maryland Medical Center. Even though we don't like the stuff they've done, you can sign yourself or other people up to get in the queue for the vaccine, so that when it gets to the criteria for your age and comorbidity status, they will give you a call and you can go in and get your vaccine. So we need to make sure you and your communities are on top of that. So we want people to get vaccinated.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We appreciate this. The recording will be available on our Facebook page. We'll also get it uploaded to our YouTube, and we'll share that on our Baltimore Green social media. Keep an eye out for the next one of these we're going to be doing. We do plan on doing them throughout the year. And with that, I want to hand it over to Ashley to close us out.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for being here and like answering all of our questions. If you guys really like everything that we did, definitely donate, like, because that helps us organize these things and, you know, get all of our stuff together and like and promote these events. So yeah, definitely donate. And then if you have any questions about membership, because we are definitely like a union model, so we really thrive off of how many members we have and who make donations and organize with us. And we will be doing guerrilla gardening this spring, so if you're interested in like doing community outreach or grassroots organizing, definitely reach out, and I'll put my email in the chat so you can reach out to me directly because I'm the current like membership coordinator. So yeah, thank you all so much for attending. Really appreciate it.
Bye. Thank you.
Good night.